Kang Tae-hyun could order a man's death without raising his voice. He could not, under any circumstances, hold eye contact with a woman for longer than 3 seconds, which was why he only ever came to the park at dawn, when it was empty, when no one could see him talking to his dog like it was the only creature on Earth who didn't scare him. Except today, it wasn't empty. Footsteps approached from the wrong direction. He tensed before he registered what it was. Not a threat, just a woman jogging to a stop beside him, her own dog straining toward his own instinct.
That's a beautiful dog.
Thank you.
Does he bite?
No.
Do you?
Excuse me?
Relax. I meant the dog. You look like you were about to run.
I don't run.
Could have fooled me. You're kind of hard to talk to, you know that?
I've been told. By who?
Everyone. Well, everyone's right. He likes me. That's usually a good sign.
A sign of what?
That you're allowed to relax around me too. Cat got your tongue? I'm here. Every morning. Try not to run next time.
If you love the softer side of dangerous men, quiet chemistry, and love stories that sneak up on you, stay till the end and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss how this one unfolds. Her name was Temi Carter, though nobody in Seoul had ever bothered to learn the whole thing. Most people just called her the American with the loud dog and the louder laugh, and she'd made peace with that a long time ago. She'd moved to Seoul 3 years earlier for a job that no longer existed, stayed for a city that had somehow become home anyway, and built a small, steady life around a coffee cart she ran near the park entrance, and a rescue mutt named Biscuit, who trusted absolutely everyone, which was either his best quality or his worst. Back in Atlanta, she'd studied hospitality management with the vague plan of one day running her own restaurant. Life had other ideas: a corporate relocation offer, a company that folded 18 months later, a lease she couldn't break, and somehow, out of all of it, a coffee cart with a hand-painted sign and a regular clientele who'd started treating her like the unofficial mayor of the block. She missed her mother's cooking, the particular hum of an Atlanta summer, the sound of her sister's voice without a delay on the line. She did not miss the man she'd left behind, though some nights, against her will, she thought about him anyway. His name had been Marcus. He'd been charming in the way certain men learn to be charming, as a tool, not a trait. And by the time she understood that every compliment came with a debt attached, she'd already reorganized her whole life around not owing him anything. Leaving had cost her almost everything she owned. It had also taught her the one lesson she carried into every relationship since. Mornings were hers, nobody else's. Until the quiet man showed up. She didn't know his name. She'd asked twice, and both times he'd changed the subject so smoothly she almost hadn't noticed. She knew he came at the same time every morning. She knew he wore suits that looked expensive, though he never once acted like it. She knew 2 men always waited by a car at the edge of the park, watching everything except him, like their whole job was making sure nobody got close. She had questions. She always had questions. But something about the careful way he held himself, like a man used to people flinching, she asked them slowly, one at a time, the way you'd approach something wild that hadn't decided yet whether to trust you. By the second week, Biscuit had stopped waiting for permission and started greeting him like an old friend. By the third, the quiet man had started bringing treats in his coat pocket, badly hidden like she thought she wouldn't notice. She noticed everything. She just didn't say so. Not yet. The following morning, mist still clung low over the grass. Temi arrived to find him already there, standing exactly where he always stood, hands in his pockets, eyes fixed on some middle distance like he was rehearsing something. "You're early," she said. "You're late." "I'm never late. You're just suspiciously punctual." She let Biscuit off the leash, watched him barrel toward the other dog with no dignity whatsoever.
"It's a little unsettling. I like routine."
I noticed. Same spot, same time, same two guys standing by that car pretending not to watch us. His jaw tightened, just slightly. They're not watching us. Sure they are. She sat down on the bench, patting the space beside her, an invitation he took a full 3 seconds to accept. You gonna tell me who you are one of these days, or is this going to stay a mystery forever? Does it need a name? Everything needs a name. That's how naming works. He almost smiled. She was starting to catalog those. The almost smiles, rare as they were, always gone before she could be sure she hadn't imagined them. Tae-hyun, he said, finally, quiet, like the word cost him something. Temi. She held out a hand. He looked at it a beat too long before taking it, and when their palms met, neither of them let go right away. Nice to officially meet you, Tae-hyun. Likewise. His ears had gone faintly pink. She decided not to mention it. Yet. So what do you do, Tae-hyun, who likes routine? Business. Groundbreaking. What kind? The kind that makes for good park conversation. She raised an eyebrow but let it slide, filing the answer away with all the others, that told her more by what they avoided than what they said. Biscuit returned, panting, dropping a stick at Tae-hyun's polished shoe like an offering. He looked at the stick, then at Temi, utterly lost. He wants you to throw it. I don't know how to throw a stick. It's not calculus. You just... She mimed the motion. Throw it. He picked it up gingerly, like it might be evidence in a case against him, and threw it with a stiff, awkward motion that sent it 3 feet to the left. Biscuit chased it anyway, delighted, and Temi laughed so hard she had to sit back down. That was the worst throw I've ever seen in my life. I told you I didn't know how. A grown man who can't throw a stick. I'm learning so much about you today. He didn't answer, but something in his shoulders had loosened that hadn't been there a week ago, and she noticed that too. By the end of the week, their mornings had settled into something that almost felt like a ritual. She brought him coffee he never asked for and always drank anyway. He brought Biscuit treats he pretended were an afterthought. They talked about nothing, weather, dogs, the terrible pigeons that ruled the park like tiny feathered warlords, and somehow nothing had started to feel like everything. She learned pieces of him, the way you learn a language nobody taught you formally, through context, through what he didn't say as much as what he did. He never mentioned family. He never mentioned work. He flinched almost imperceptibly whenever a phone buzzed in his pocket, and he always stepped a few feet away to answer it, voice dropping into a register she'd never heard him use with her, clipped, cold, a different man entirely for the 30 seconds the call lasted. One morning, she caught the tail end of one of those calls before she noticed her there. "Handle it," he said, flat, final, and something about the way the 2 words landed made the hair on her arms rise. He turned, saw her watching, and the coldness dropped off him so fast it was like watching a mask come off, except she was starting to wonder which version was the mask. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Fine. Work. You said that already. It's usually true." She let it go again, filing it beside all the other things she wasn't asking about. She told herself it wasn't her business. She told herself that every single morning, and every single morning she found herself wondering anyway. What she didn't know, what she had no way of knowing, was that 3 streets over, in an office on the top floor of a building with no sign on the door, men were speaking his name in a very different tone than she used. Not Tae-hyun, Not the shy man who fed her dog treats and blushed when she caught him staring. They called him something else entirely, and they were starting to notice that every morning at dawn, for exactly 40 minutes, the head of the Kang organization disappeared from every camera, every check-in, every place his enemies expected to find him. Somewhere he couldn't be watched, somewhere he couldn't be reached, somewhere as far as anyone else was concerned, he didn't exist at all. Back home in the modest apartment she'd made her own, far from Atlanta and everything she'd left behind, Temi sat on her windowsill with a cup of tea gone cold, turning something over in her mind she wasn't ready to admit out loud. She hadn't planned on liking anyone again, certainly not a man she knew nothing about, who answered every question with another question, and who carried himself like every room he entered might turn hostile any second. She'd built her whole life in this city specifically so she wouldn't have to depend on anyone's approval again, not a man's, not anyone's, and yet there was something in the way he looked at her, careful, almost reverent, like he wasn't used to being looked at back, that undid every rule she'd made for herself. She recognized guardedness. She'd worn it herself for years, had built an entire personality out of self-sufficiency because depending on someone once had cost her more than she was willing to pay again. What she hadn't expected was how much she wanted to be the reason he finally set his down. She thought about calling her sister, telling her about the strange, quiet, expensive-looking man who couldn't throw a stick and blushed at compliments. She decided against it. Some things felt too fragile to say out loud yet, like naming them might scare them off. She didn't know his last name. She didn't know what he did, who those men by the car worked for, or why her stomach dropped every single time his phone rang and his whole body changed shape around it. She told herself she'd ask him properly, soon. She had no idea that somewhere across the city, a decision was already being made about her, one that had nothing to do with what she wanted and everything to do with who Tae-hyun had let himself become around her. Tae-hyun had built his entire life around one rule: nobody gets close enough to be used against you. He'd learned it before he'd learned most things. His father had taught him with words, cold ones, delivered across a dinner table when Tae-hyun was still young enough to think love was supposed to feel like something other than instruction. The world had taught him with consequences: a driver killed for information he didn't even have, a business partner's daughter used as leverage in a negotiation that ended badly, a cousin who'd made the mistake of falling for someone outside the organization and paid for it in ways Tae-hyun still didn't let himself think about. Softness got people killed in his world. Attachment was a door left unlocked. So he'd spent 2 decades keeping every door in his life bolted shut, including the ones that led to himself. Women, especially, had always been the easiest doors to lock, not because he didn't want, he did more than he'd ever admit, but because wanting made you predictable, and predictable men in his line of work didn't survive very long. He'd watched enough of his father's rivals fall exactly that way, undone not by strength, but by the one soft spot they couldn't bring themselves to protect. So he'd trained himself out of eye contact, out of small talk, out of anything that might read as an opening. It had worked for 15 years. Meetings, negotiations, even threats. He could sit across from any of it without blinking. It had lasted exactly until a woman with a loud dog and a louder laugh sat down next to him on a park bench and asked if he bit. He didn't understand what she'd done to him. He only knew that for 40 minutes every morning, the version of himself that flinched at ringing phones and slept with a gun under his pillow simply didn't exist. There was only a man who blushed too easily and threw sticks badly, and a woman who somehow made that feel like the safest thing in the world instead of the most dangerous. He knew it couldn't last. Everything about his life said it couldn't last. He kept showing up anyway, telling himself each morning would be the last one, and meaning it a little less each time. The following Tuesday, everything changed. Tae-hyun arrived at the park later than usual, jaw tight, movements sharper than she'd ever seen them. Temi noticed immediately. The way he scanned the tree line before he even looked at her, the way his hand kept drifting toward his jacket like he was checking for something. "You okay?" she asked. "Fine." "You don't look fine." "I'm fine, Temi." His voice came out harder than he meant it to, and he caught himself, exhaled, softened. "I'm sorry, it's work. It's nothing." "Doesn't look like nothing." He didn't answer. Biscuit, sensing the tension the way dogs always did, pressed himself against Tae-hyun, and for a moment the man's shoulders dropped an inch, some of the tightness bleeding out of him. "Can I ask you something?" she said carefully. "You always do." "Are you in trouble?" The question landed heavier than she'd meant it to. He looked at her, really looked, the kind of look he usually couldn't hold for more than 3 seconds, and this time he didn't look away at all. "Not the kind you need to worry about." "That's not a no. It's the only answer I have." She didn't believe him, but something in his face told her pushing further wouldn't get her the truth, only a wall, so she let it go for now, and reached over to squeeze his hand instead, quick, brief, gone before either of them could make it mean too much. His whole body went still. Then, slowly, his fingers curled around hers. Neither of them let go for a long moment. "Whatever it is," she said quietly, "you don't have to carry it alone every morning, even if you don't tell me what it is." He didn't answer, but he didn't let go of her hand either, not until Biscuit demanded attention with a bark that startled them both back into the ordinary world. The following Tuesday, in an office she would never see, a man named Sung-min stood across from Tae-hyun with a folder in his hand and a look on his face that made the temperature in the room drop several degrees. "She's been seen with you 6 mornings running. The Choi family's people noticed 3 days ago. She's no one. She's someone now." "The moment they saw you with her, she stopped being no one." He set the folder down, unopened, like he already knew Tae-hyun wouldn't want to look at whatever was inside. "You know how this works. You know what they'll do with this." Tae-hyun's jaw worked. "She doesn't know anything." "Doesn't matter. They don't need her to know anything. They just need her to matter to you." Sung-min's voice dropped, not unkind, but final. "Which, from where I'm standing, she clearly does. I've known her 3 weeks. 3 weeks is enough. You've never gone back to the same place twice in a row in your life, and you've gone 6 mornings straight to a park bench for a woman who sells coffee out of a cart." Sung-min shook his head slowly. "I've worked for your family 15 years. I've never once seen you do that." Tae-hyun said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't confirm exactly what Sung-min already suspected. "End it," Sung-min said, "before they do it for you." He didn't go to the park the next morning, or the one after that. Temi told herself it didn't matter. She told herself a lot of things that week, that she barely knew him, that whatever had been building between them was probably nothing, that she'd been foolish to let herself feel anything for a man who'd never once told her his last name. She almost believed it some mornings. Other mornings she sat on the same bench, coffee going cold in her hand, watching the gate like it might still open, and hated herself a little for how much his absence hollowed out something she hadn't realized was full. Biscuit noticed too. He'd taken to trotting toward the gate every morning out of habit, tail wagging in anticipation, before slowing to a stop and looking back at her like he didn't understand either. "I know, buddy," she murmured one morning, scratching behind his ears. "Me neither." By the 4th morning without him, she'd stopped bringing the second coffee. By the 5th, she'd stopped watching the gate at all, or told herself she had, which wasn't quite the same thing. She didn't know that 4 blocks away, Tae-hyun was standing at his office window, watching the sun come up over a city he controlled more of than he'd ever wanted, aching in a way he had no name for, and refusing to let himself go find one. He'd rewritten his morning route twice, avoided every street that led toward that park, and still found himself checking his watch at the exact time he used to be throwing sticks badly for a dog that liked him more than he deserved. She didn't know that his silence wasn't rejection, it was the only kind of protection he knew how to offer. By the end of that week, the balance around them changed entirely, not between them, but around them. A car Temi didn't recognize had started parking near her coffee cart in the mornings. Not close enough to seem deliberate, close enough that she noticed anyway, the way you notice a change in weather before you can name what's different about the air. Then came the man who lingered too long by her register, asking questions that sounded casual and weren't. How long she'd lived in Seoul, whether she had family back home, whether she was close to anyone here. She gave short answers and a longer stare, and he left without buying anything, which told her more than his questions had. She called Tae-hyun that night. It rang twice and went to voicemail. She told herself that meant nothing. She was wrong. 3 days later, walking home later than usual after a delivery ran long, she heard footsteps behind her that matched her pace too precisely to be coincidence. She sped up. They sped up. She turned down a street she knew, heart hammering, hand tightening around her keys like they could do anything against a threat she couldn't even see clearly. A hand closed around her arm from behind. She spun, fist already rising on instinct, and stopped, breath catching, when she saw who it was. Tae-hyun stood there, tie gone, jacket torn at the shoulder, a look on his face she'd never seen before. Not shyness, not softness, something colder, sharper, entirely unfamiliar. "Don't scream," he said low. "Just walk with me, now." And that's when Temi realized the quiet man from the park, the one who blushed and fumbled and could barely hold her gaze, had just stepped between her and something dangerous enough to make his hands shake for an entirely different reason. She had no idea who he really was. She was about to find out. Kang Tae-hyun didn't stop walking until they were 3 blocks from where he'd grabbed her arm, down an alley she didn't recognize, through a door that led into what looked like the back office of a shuttered dry cleaner. Inside, the lights were dim, and 2 men she'd never seen straightened the moment he entered, falling into a kind of stillness that told her everything his suits and his silences hadn't. "Sit," he said. "I don't want to sit. I want to know what's happening. Temi, you've been calling me Temi for 3 weeks and telling me nothing. That ends now." Her voice shook, but she held his gaze, and something in her refusal to flinch seemed to steady him more than it unsettled him. He exhaled, dragged a hand through his hair, and for the first time since she'd met him, looked like a man running out of places to hide. "My name isn't just Tae-hyun," he said. "My family runs an organization most people in this city cross the street to avoid talking about. I run it now. I have for 6 years." She didn't say anything. She was doing the math, watching pieces rearrange themselves, the suits, the men by the car, the calls he always stepped away to take, the way rooms seemed to hold their breath around him without her ever noticing why. "You're the mafia boss," she said, flat. Like saying it plainly might make it less true. "I'm told that's the word people use." "And the men following me tonight?" "Rivals. They found out about you, about us." He said it carefully, like the word us cost him something to claim out loud. "I should have ended this weeks ago. I told myself I would. I didn't." "Why not?" He looked at her the way he'd looked at her that first morning, like the question required more courage than he had ready. "Because for 40 minutes every day, you made me forget I was supposed to be someone people were afraid of." The room went quiet. Outside, a car passed, headlights sliding briefly across the blinds, and neither of them moved until it was gone. "You should have told me," she said, quieter now. "I know. You should have let me decide if the risk was mine to take." That landed harder than he expected. He nodded, slowly, like a man accepting a verdict he already knew was fair. "You're right," he said. "I'm sorry." She stayed at the safe house that night, in a small back room with a cot and a lock on the door she didn't use. She didn't sleep much. Neither, she suspected, did he. She could hear him in the front room past midnight, low voices on the phone, footsteps that never quite stilled. By morning, exhaustion had softened the sharp edges of the night before into something gentler. He brought her coffee, made badly, clearly by someone unaccustomed to making it for anyone but himself, and set it down without a word. "This is terrible," she said after one sip. "I know. You could have asked one of your men to make it." "I wanted to make it myself." She looked at him for a long moment, something in her chest loosening despite everything. "Even though you clearly don't know how. Especially because I don't know how." It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it felt like one, and she let it be enough for now. By the following week, he'd told her more, not everything, but enough, that his father had built the organization on fear, and Tae-hyun had spent his adult life trying to run it on something closer to order, though the distinction rarely mattered to outsiders, that he had almost no one he trusted completely, that trust in his world was a currency people spent to get close enough to hurt you, that the park had been an accident, and she had never once, in 3 weeks, felt like an accident. She told him about Atlanta, about Marcus and the version of herself she'd had to rebuild after him, careful, self-sufficient, unwilling to hand her mornings to anyone again. She told him she wasn't looking to be protected, she was looking to be chosen, on equal footing by someone who saw her as a partner instead of a liability to manage. "I don't want to be handled, I want to be told the truth, even when it's inconvenient, especially then." "That's fair. I'm not very good at it yet." "You're getting better." He almost smiled, one of the real ones now, rarer than the almost smiles from the park, but no longer quite so fleeting. 2 mornings later, danger reintroduced itself without warning. Temi's coffee cart, closed for the week on Tae-hyun's insistence, was broken into overnight, the register emptied, the espresso machine smashed beyond repair, and on the counter, deliberately placed where she'd be sure to find it, a single white peony with its stem snapped clean. She called Tae-hyun before she'd even finished processing what she was looking at. He arrived within 15 minutes, and the calm he usually wore like armor had cracked into something far more dangerous. Quiet, controlled fury, the kind that made the 2 men who came with him avoid his eyes entirely. "This isn't about money," he said, turning the broken flower over in his hand. "Then what is it about?" "A message. Someone wants me to know they can reach you whenever they choose." His jaw tightened. "Someone who knows I'd rather burn my own organization down than let that happen again." "Again?" He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice had gone low, careful, like each word had to be pried loose from somewhere he didn't like visiting. "My cousin fell in love with someone outside our world once. It didn't end the way either of them wanted." Temi absorbed that in silence, understanding for the first time the true weight of what she'd stepped into, and understanding too that he'd let her step into it anyway, because some part of him had decided she was worth the risk before he had admitted it to himself. "I'm not running," she said. "I want that clear. Whatever this is, I'm not disappearing because it's dangerous. I disappeared for a man who scared me. I'm not doing it again for one I actually care about." Something in his expression broke open at that. Not fear this time, but disbelief, like he hadn't let himself imagine she might choose to stay. "You should be more afraid than you are," he said quietly. Maybe, but I'd rather be scared and honest than safe and lying to myself. She stepped closer, close enough that he had to look down at her, close enough that neither of them could pretend the distance between them was still comfortable. So tell me what we're actually dealing with, all of it. What they were dealing with, it turned out, was closer than neither of them expected. Tae-hyun called a meeting that evening, a small one, trusted circle only, which by his own count numbered exactly 3 people, one of whom was Sung-min. He laid out the threat plainly, the break-in, the flower, the surveillance on Temi that had started weeks before either of them noticed. The Choi family wouldn't bother with theater like this. A dead flower isn't their style. They'd have just taken her. Then who? Tae-hyun asked. Sung-min was quiet for a beat too long. Tae-hyun noticed. He'd spent 15 years learning to notice exactly that kind of silence. Sung-min, he said, is there something you want to tell me? The older man's composure held for another moment before it didn't. I warned you to end it. You didn't listen. I thought if the threat felt real enough, you'd protect yourself the way you should have from the start. The room went utterly still. You did this, Tae-hyun said, voice dropping to something far colder than anger. You broke into her shop. You destroyed her livelihood. You left a dead flower on her counter to frighten her into leaving me. I did it to protect you. Everything I have ever done, I have done to protect this family, and you're throwing all of it away for a woman who sells coffee out of a cart. She has a name. That's not the point. It's exactly the point. Tae-hyun's voice didn't rise, but something in it made every man in the room straighten. You don't get to decide who's worth protecting on my behalf, not anymore. The fallout took 3 days to settle. Quiet reassignments, quiet consequences, none of it Temi's business to know in detail, though Tae-hyun told her the shape of it anyway, because he'd promised her the truth, and he intended to keep that promise even when it cost him something. He's no longer with the organization, was all he said, and something in his face told her not to ask further, not because he was hiding it, but because some weights weren't hers to carry. They stood in her rebuilt shop that evening. New espresso machine, new register. Tae-hyun had insisted on covering the cost before she'd finished protesting. The space quiet, the sign flipped to closed, the city dimming outside the windows into that particular blue that comes right before full dark. You didn't have to do all this, she said, gesturing at the new equipment. I wanted to. You keep saying that, wanting things. I'm new at it. He said it plainly, without irony, and something about the honesty of it undid her more than any grand declaration could have. She crossed the small distance between them, close enough now that his breath caught audibly, close enough that his hands, usually so still and controlled, found her waist like they'd been waiting weeks for permission. Tae-hyun, yes? You can kiss me now, if you want. He looked at her for a long moment, like he was memorizing the moment before he let himself have it, and then he kissed her, careful at first, like he still couldn't quite believe he was allowed, and then not careful at all, one hand rising to cradle her jaw like she was something he'd been afraid to want out loud for far too long. She kissed him back with all the certainty he lacked, steady where he was still learning, and when they finally broke apart, his forehead resting against hers, he was breathing like a man who'd just run a very long distance. I've been wanting to do that since the first morning. I know. You blush the exact same way every time you almost do. I do not. You're doing it right now. He didn't argue further. He just kissed her again, softer this time, unhurried, like a man finally allowing himself to stop bracing for the ground to disappear. The weeks that followed settled into something neither of them had quite let themselves imagine. Mornings in the park, evenings at her shop, the slow, deliberate work of two guarded people learning to be less guarded around each other. He introduced her carefully to the parts of his world that couldn't be avoided. A dinner with senior members of the organization, formal and tense, where she held her own with a steadiness that visibly surprised everyone at the table except him. He'd expected nothing less. "They were testing you," he told her afterwards, in the quiet of the car ride home. "I know. I've been tested by scarier people than businessmen in expensive suits. That obvious?" Painfully. He laughed, a real laugh, rare and unguarded, the kind she was starting to collect the way she'd once collected his almost smiles. "You handled it better than most of them do." High praise from a man who couldn't throw a stick. "I've been practicing." With the dog? With the dog.
She smiled, resting her head against his shoulder as the city lights slid past the window, and understood in that moment exactly how far they'd both traveled from a man who couldn't hold eye contact at a woman who'd sworn off giving her mornings to anyone. The final test came not from rivals or from anyone inside his organization, but from an old associate of the Choi family, testing whether the rumors were true, whether the head of the Kang organization had truly gone soft over an American woman with a coffee cart and no fear of him at all. He arrived uninvited to her shop on a quiet Thursday afternoon, flanked by two men, his tone polite in the particular way that made polite sound like a threat. "I only wanted to see for myself," he said, looking around the small shop with open condescension. "The great Kang Tae-hyun brought to his knees by a barista?" "I don't kneel for anyone," Tae-hyun said, stepping between him and Temi without raising his voice. "But I'd choose her over every alliance you're offering, every time, without hesitation. If that's weakness in your eyes, I can live with how you see me." The man studied him for a long moment, searching for the flinch he expected and not finding it. Then, slowly, he inclined his head, not quite respect, but something adjacent to it, and left without another word. Temi exhaled once the door closed behind him, hands unsteady on the counter. That was terrifying. "You didn't look terrified." "I've had practice not looking terrified. Doesn't mean I wasn't." He crossed to her, tilted her chin up gently. "You never have to pretend with me. Not fear, not anything." "I know," she smiled, small and real. "That's kind of the whole point of you, isn't it?" He kissed her then, slow and certain, right there in the shop with the afternoon light slanting gold across the floor. No bodyguards, no watching eyes, no version of himself he had to perform. Just a man who'd spent a lifetime building walls, choosing deliberately and completely to let one particular person stay standing inside them. When they finally pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his chest, laughing softly. "For a man who couldn't hold eye contact 3 months ago, you've gotten very good at this. I had a good teacher. You had a persistent one. That too." Some nights later, back at the same park bench where all of it had begun, Temi sat with her head on Tae-hyun's shoulder, Biscuit asleep at their feet, the city humming quietly around them in the particular hush of very early morning. "Do you ever think about how ridiculous this is? The most feared man in Seoul undone by a woman who yelled at him for standing on flowers?" "Every day," he said. "I still don't understand how you did it. I didn't do anything. I just didn't treat you like you were something to be afraid of. That's exactly what did it." She smiled into the quiet,
understanding, finally, the lesson underneath everything they'd survived together, that the strongest people weren't the ones who never let themselves be afraid, but the ones who let themselves be seen anyway, who chose connection even when every instinct screamed at them to protect themselves instead. He had spent a lifetime believing softness was a weakness that got people killed. She had spent years believing self-sufficiency was the only safety worth having. Somewhere between a badly thrown stick and a kiss in a rebuilt coffee shop, they'd both learned the same thing. Real strength was never about the absence of fear. It was about choosing someone fully anyway. "Stay," he said, quietly, not really a question. "I was always going to," she said. "You just had to catch up." He laughed, soft, unguarded, entirely his own, and pulled her closer as the sun came up over the park, over the city, over a man who'd spent his whole life being feared, finally, quietly, unafraid himself. If this story of a shy, powerful man and the woman who refused to be scared of him found its way into your heart, we'd love to hear. What part of Tae-hyun's transformation moved you the most? Let us know below, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next story like this one.